Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. It's really my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event on strengthening Europe with the Governor of the Banque de France, François Villeroy de Galhau. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's extensive programming for the World Bank IMF 2025 Spring Meetings. Twice a year, our GeoEconomics team, together with finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world, discuss the country's economic outlook and how they engage with Bretton Woods institutions. In just a few short years, thanks to our Bretton Woods 2.0 program and the leadership of Senior Director and new Chair of our International Economics, Josh Lipsky, the Atlantic Council, our IMF-World Bank Week of events has become an important forum for informed discussion to bring light and not heat to GeoEconomics debates. I think we have 45 events this week, so they've really done tremendous work. The governor comes to Washington at a time of heightened uncertainty caused by, to some degree, tariffs and retaliations to tariffs, but also by economic statecraft and the weaponization of supply chains along geopolitical fault lines. We have, of course, conflict in Europe and the Middle East, artificial intelligence being adopted across the globe at a breathtaking speed. Europe finds itself at a pivotal moment, some might even say a French moment. The Trump administration has made it quite clear that it expects the European Union to make a larger financial contribution to Ukraine's defense as well as its own. President Trump has also said he does not consider the EU a friend on economics or trade. All of this has led the rest of Europe to take a more favorable view to President Macron's calls for the EU to embrace strategic autonomy. And in the months ahead, Governor will be one of the key figures who will determine whether France and the EU can pull this off. So the governor is not only a steward of monetary policy and financial regulation, he has had a prominent career at the French Treasury and at the helm of BNP Paribas Bank. Given his deep family ties to Germany, we're especially eager to hear his thoughts on whether their new coalition government presents fresh opportunities for the EU. This event is being broadcast live and is co-hosted by our GeoEconomics Center and the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, led by Senior Director Jorn Fleck. Mr. Governor, we are honored that you have chosen the Atlantic Council as the venue for your keynote speech on strengthening Europe. And after your remarks, we look forward to hearing from you in conversation with Charles Lichfield, the Deputy Director of the GeoEconomics Center and our Boyd and Gray Senior Fellow. Merci, Monsieur Governor.
Thank you, Jenna. Thanks to all of you for welcoming me in the Atlantic Council. We sit just a few blocks from Franklin Park and Lafayette Square. And if necessary, Washington's geography reminds us of the enduring bond between our two nations. As the Marquis de Lafayette, probably as famous in the US as in France, hero of the two words, once wrote to George Washington, I quote him, "Humanity has won its battle. Liberty now has a country." From the very start, the cause of liberty, of freedom, has been one we have carried together across the Atlantic, and I strongly wish it is still today, despite the very troubled waters we are sailing through. Let me also remind you with gratitude that Dean Acheson, who played a key role in the creation of your Atlantic Council, was also instrumental in the early steps of European integration. This is perhaps less well known, but he urged the French government in 1949 and 1950 to take the bold step leading to the Schuman Declaration of 9th of May 1950, and hence of what would become the European Union. For Dean Acheson, as for many Americans, the EU was not designed, and sorry for the quotation, was not designed to screw the US. On the contrary. And let me, by this opportunity, also pay tribute to his French counterpart, Robert Schuman, at that time French Foreign Affairs Minister. He came from the French-German border, Jenna which you alluded to, and it's a legacy I feel personally connected to, having grown up like him in that very region where our two nations meet. Hence, I will first highlight that the transatlantic partnership has been so far strong as balanced as no other worldwide. Second, nevertheless, the US trade policy shift will harm the global economy starting at home. Lastly, and more positively, I will trace out a path for this possible European moment you mentioned, if, I stress, if we see the opportunity. Let me try to state the obvious first, but telling the truth means sometimes reminding the obvious at present. The US and the EU are the world's two largest economies, maintaining one of the largest bilateral economic relationships. Then there is this question of the trade surplus. Let me give some figures. If I look at the surplus in goods, obviously there is a European surplus of 244 billion US dollar. But there is a services deficit which has significantly widened in the last years and which is at the advantage of the US for $125 billion. If I add a third element, which is a net primary income flows in favor of US firms, this leads ultimately to a balanced current account. Can I also add that the effective applied tariffs between the EU and the US were close before recent developments, 3.95% for the EU on US products, 3.5% for the US on European products. Let me remind also the obvious, value-added tax, VAT, is not a customs duty. It is levied on the final value of imported and domestically produced goods equally, like the sales tax in the US. And nobody would argue in Europe that the sales tax is a customs duty. European majority-owned affiliates directly employed an estimated 3.5 million US workers in 2023, and European-based investors represent close to 50% of all foreign holdings of US securities that same year. Last figure, and I will stop there, but only to show how deep, old, and balanced our relationship is. Today, 120,000 European researchers are working in the US, universities, labs, and firms. I must unfortunately go to my second point about the US policy shift and its harmful consequences. Let me be honest. I don't mean that the latest globalization wave was a fairy tale. It had its problems. It had its imbalances, both social and financial. But the current lose-lose game will obviously increase these problems and in no way solve them. The new trade measures tariffs announced, as well as the increasing unpredictability which affects confidence, constitute without any doubt a major negative shock and self-inflicted to the global economy, but first and foremost to the US economy. I say that with sadness. According to all analysis by US and international banks, and yesterday by the IMF, the American economy could suffer this year from an average estimated loss of around 1 percentage point in annual growth, less, and a similar sized 1 point rise in underlying inflation. There could even be a US recession, which was unthinkable 3 months ago. But bad news for the US is bad news for all, including for Europe. According to our preliminary assessment, there could be a direct negative impact of 0.25% to euro area GDP growth this year. The impact on inflation remains more uncertain, but could be, as a whole, on the downside. And this is a significant difference. Our inflation would diminish while the US one would increase. That said, our baseline scenario for France and the euro area remains that of an exit from inflation without a recession. Financial markets. As we all know, they reacted very negatively to this trade announcement with a very unusual combination, let me stress it, of a sharp drop in US equity indexes, a rise, very surprisingly, in US long-term bond yields, and a broad-based decline in the US dollar. The economic uncertainty may possibly threaten financial stability. I say it with some gravity. And I add that such deeply disruptive effects would also result from attacks on the independence and credibility of central banks. Let me, on this occasion, express again my gratitude to Fed Chair Jay Powell, who admirably shows how a central banker must behave. One word about monetary policy, if you allow me. Independent from political impatience, our monetary policies are also autonomous from one another across the Atlantic. This in no way precludes, and this is my commitment to you, this in no way precludes a continuous, trusted, and indispensable dialogue, which is more necessary than ever for global financial stability. But this autonomy is precisely what allows each of us to fulfill our domestic price stability mandate. In Europe, this is made possible by one of the greatest institutional achievements of the 90s, the creation of the euro. I am old enough, I must confess, to have been personally in Maastricht 33 years ago. And much more recently, I was in Frankfurt last week for our latest decision to cut interest rates. There is currently, as I said, no inflationary risk in Europe. And we can almost say mission accomplished when it comes to bringing inflation back to our 2% target. The significant deceleration of wages is another proof thereof. It is therefore both fair and appropriate that compared to the US Fed or the Bank of England, the ECB has started cutting rates earlier, last June, faster, and likely further this year. While this supports activity in the short term, the key to strengthening European growth remains structural through a broader mobilization of our internal resources. And this brings me to my last and more positive considerations about Europe. Can I first say, hope that we use the 90-day pause to seriously talk across the Atlantic. The least economically harmful option would be indeed to negotiate and then de-escalate the situation, rather than setting off a transatlantic spiral of tariff hikes. So far, Europeans, and you could witness it, Europeans have reacted in a remarkably united and calm manner. Furthermore, I strongly wish Europe and the US can still commit together to what I call a pragmatic multilateralism. I mean a multilateralism which is focused on some practical themes of common interest. Let me name just a few. financial stability, cross-border payments and crypto assets, cybersecurity, or the fight against financial crime and the prevention of extreme climate events. I insist, let us resolutely preserve and support the multilateral institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, born and hosted in this great country and this great city of Washington. Let me express one final hope. If this difficult current situation has a silver lining, it is to possibly usher the European moment. Europe, despite its limitations, and we are aware of these limitations, as a safe haven of economic predictability and confidence, of rule of law, of social cohesion. But this will not happen without bold moves. We can already see the impressive shift of the next German government. And these moves are obvious on defense. But let me focus today on economy as the other pillar of this European moment. We need what I would call a general mobilization, focusing on three imperatives, three I's, taking the best of the impressive economic success of America. Or if you prefer, rather than three I's, size multiplied by muscle, multiplied by speed. What do I mean? And I will be very short, but this is a sum up of the Draghi report, so to say. First, 400 pages. First, we need to integrate, first I, the single market more. This means making the most of its size, as large in GDP terms as the US, by removing internal barriers in several areas such as services and energy. We also need, second I, to invest better, giving priority to the most promising breakthrough innovations, particularly those related to AI. And to succeed there, we need to build financial muscle through a genuine savings and investment union, fostering more our abundant private savings. We don't lack private savings, on the contrary, but we must foster them towards equity and venture capital, again, US type. And third I, we need to innovate faster. Europe needs simplification, obviously, less bureaucracy, fewer procedures and shorter deadlines, while stressing, and this is one of our messages, that simplification is not deregulation, and we could probably come back to that. Can I add a general consideration on this European agenda and this European moment? To successfully implement these three I's, these three imperatives, we urgently need a binding, visible, and not too distant calendar. Such a calendar will mobilize all our political and economic forces, as did in the past, the 1st of January 93 for the single market, also 1st of January 99 for the single currency. Let me conclude in quoting the great French writer Victor Hugo. He wrote almost 2 centuries ago, "A day will come when there will be no other battlefields but markets opening to trade and mines. A day will come when these two great groups, the United States of America and the United States of Europe, will stand face to face, reaching out across the seas, exchanging their products, their commerce, their industries, their art, and their genius." Unquote. That day, alas, has grown more distant in recent times. But we need such nice utopias. The transatlantic sky has darkened considerably. But even in the storm, we must not lose sight of our long-term course. You, the American people, will decide what must be said and what must be fought for on your side of the Atlantic as loud and clear as necessary. As Europeans, our task is clear: to strengthen our own side of the ocean. Let us, in the very name of the Atlantic spirit this Council embodies, let us seize the European moment. Thank you for your attention.
I would also encourage our viewers here and online to ask questions via askac.org. I will choose the best questions on this iPad in front of me, and you will get to ask indirectly via me at least some questions to the Governor. So thank you very much. I thought we might start with the European moment, first of all. So a lot of interesting ideas came up in your speech. Some of these I think Americans will have heard before. Capital Markets Union, channeling investments into, or channeling European savings into infrastructure. So what do you think can happen on a realistic timeline, a calendar? What do you think, what would your priorities be in the next few months?
Can I take your point that you already heard of this, some of these ideas, and not all of them I knew, I couldn't agree more. What is new is a feeling of necessity and emergency on the European side. And probably for two reasons. If you look at last year, there was a Draghi report. And it was a first wake-up call. And to say, look at productivity and innovation, there was perhaps on the European side some, how could I say, laziness or slowness. We were not that bad. If you look at GDP per capita, it increased in the last 25 years in the euro area by 26%, which is not ridiculous. But compared to the US, in the US, it was about 40%. So we were lagging behind. And then the second wake-up call, which is still more stringent, are this new trade policy and the idea of a completely fragmented world economy and some severe threat, to say the least, on the transatlantic bond. So we must now recover the mastery of our own economic destiny. We will see exactly how it's translated. It's obvious in defense. If you look in this defense field, the move in the last 2 months have been unprecedented, completely unprecedented, and not only in Germany, which I quoted. I insist on the second leg, which is economy. And here we have more or less the agenda. I spoke of the Draghi report. Perhaps less well known is a competitiveness compass presented by the Commission early February, but I can see that there are some specialists in the audience, and the Saving and Investment Union program presented by Commissioner Albuquerque on March the 19th. Let us put it in legislative proposals and have a fixed calendar to conclude with, to implement it. I insist on that, not only for political reasons, also for economic reasons. Can I say it this way? Some months ago, most of European firms were very mobilized, excited to invest in the US. As you are probably aware, they are a bit less today. And again, I say it with sadness. These are bad news for everybody, but first and foremost for this country. So, how can we give to these firms a stronger European perspective to invest and innovate in a stronger and broader and deeper single market, including from the financial standpoint? I think it's a unique opportunity and it's a necessity.
So, thank you very much. And as part of the opportunity, many people will have noticed that there is a new interest from financial markets in the Eurozone, in euro-denominated assets. Some might even call it a frantic search for a new safe asset. But the European market is more complicated. There's no US Treasury bond equivalent, so that you have German bonds. They went up a little bit when the yields went up a little bit when it was announced that Germany would be spending more. Maybe some people didn't notice, but the cost has come down since because people have been looking for a new place to put their money that isn't necessarily under the purview of this US administration. But I was wondering if I could get your French perspective on this. So there's more French debt in the market than there is German debt. So this is probably an opportunity.
This is off the record. I wouldn't mention it as a French advantage, but please go on.
Well, we are on the record, unfortunately, Governor. It's a reality, and France's borrowing costs are obviously something that people follow closely, and the spreads have not increased over the past few weeks. They've remained the same, and the borrowing costs have come down. So this has mainly been seen as good news. But I was very intrigued to see that your German counterpart, Mr. Nagel, this morning, speaking to our friends at Bloomberg, said that this wasn't necessarily good news. He didn't necessarily welcome the fact that people were moving away from the US dollar-denominated assets into European ones. There may be some short-term advantages to be drawn, but his main conclusion from the volatility of the past few weeks was a gloomier one. He wanted US treasuries to remain attractive. So I was wondering if you had the same opinion of as his, or whether from a French perspective you saw things slightly differently.
First, I am a close friend and not only a colleague to Joachim Nagel, so I broadly agree with what he said. I didn't see exactly, but this is probably this point, which I mentioned as an unusual combination on the US market. In normal times, when you have equity prices going down, bond prices are going up as a safe haven. Mm-hmm. And what happened in the US was exceptional in these circumstances. And probably, this is what I read, it played a role in the evolution of the trade policy. What happened on our side of the Atlantic was more expected. We had also a drop in equity prices due to the bad economic news. Again, these are bad news for everybody, less bad for us, but still bad for us. And then we had a rise in bond prices and a fall in long-term yields. So the evolution we could see in Germany and in France in parallel is an expected one. The dollar plays a very important role in the international monetary system, and it will probably remain. But if there is some kind of gradual diversification, we will see. As I said, this could increase the attractiveness of Europe, but not only its currency, of its economy, and we have to deserve it. There is probably a strong link, not very often stressed, between the attractivity of the euro itself and the depth of the single financial market, what we call now savings and investment union. The question of the safe asset has been on the table for long. There could be several solutions on that. But also the question of suppressing internal barriers, having, as I mentioned, a much deeper equity market, etc. All this could be a consistent program, but it will take time, and as it will take time, let us start now.
And I was very interested to read in your letter to the French president recently that your sort of timeline for what you thought France should do took us to 2019. So you think that France should manage to get its deficit back to 3% by 2019. There are certain decisions that should be taken and efforts that should be made for monetary sovereignty, budgetary sovereignty, growth. And you seem to see that the objective timeline for this should take us to 2019. I was wondering what the...
This was more for fiscal policy, if I may. For monetary sovereignty, fortunately, we have built it in Europe, thanks to the euro. Mm-hmm. And imagine the present situation without the euro. It would be very difficult to manage. On monetary sovereignty, we have a need, which is to build a digital euro. This was a pre-existing project, as you are aware, but obviously its necessity is greater than ever. On the fiscal front, this is more a national and a specifically French question. Why did I mention 29?
29, excuse me, not 2019, yes. 2029.
2019, we would have solved the issue. But 29, because this is a reasonable calendar to reach a 3% deficit. We are, unfortunately, we expect this year 5.4, so we are much beyond 3%. And 3% is not a magic figure in European law. It's the level of deficit where we would have a primary balance and then stabilize the debt ratio to GDP. And I think this is a reasonable objective. As we are aware, Germany had the opposite challenge. They had very sound public finance, and I really pay tribute to it. I also pay tribute, they are using now this fiscal room to increase infrastructures and defense. As you mentioned, it increased for a while the long-term yields in Germany, but now we are back to the figure where we were in February. So.
Thank you. Maybe this inspires two questions. First, on the domestic political constraints. I mean, you are not part of the government of France. You're the governor of the Banque de France. But nonetheless,
I am a very independent central bank.
Very independent.
We could see in recent times how independence is important.
And we pay tribute to that independence and hope that we see it in all the markets that we follow here at the Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center. Nonetheless, you do make comments occasionally on French domestic policy, not so much on French domestic politics. But everyone who follows France sees that there's a lot of uncertainty, a very fragmented parliament, maybe even elections this year. So how do you think France can stick to this calendar of fiscal consolidation, making the necessary reforms? When you try to convince people of this vision, what are the one or two arguments that you try to hammer home?
I will not make any comments about French politics. By the way, the English language is much more appropriate because you have these two different words of policies and politics. And for those of you who speak French, we have the same word, politique. But these are two very different concepts. So I speak about policies, not about politics. I have no clues when will be the next election, who will win. The only point I make as an independent central banker on fiscal policy is that it is national interest. Whoever wins, we have to reduce deficits, we have to stabilize debt, and in that order, we have to stabilize public expenditures, which are in France higher than the European average. So, this is the recommendation I give. This is the technical figures we published as an independent and credible institution. It's up, obviously, to Parliament and government then to decide. But probably the European tradition is here a bit different from the US one. It's quite usual that European central banks, it's also true for my Italian or for my German colleagues, speak about fiscal policy. And we are not the deciders, but we are, so to say, advisors, or we contribute to public debate with our independent expertise. And I think it's very welcome.
Thank you. We also welcome public debate at the Atlantic Council, and I'd encourage anyone watching online to submit your questions. Askac.org is the address, and we'll also take a few in-person questions in the audience, so feel free to raise your hand. Last question from me, also bouncing off something you said on the digital euro. You did say that there's work that remains to be done on this. I see some divergence at this point between what's going on in the EU and the US. Another point of divergence in the EU, or in the Eurozone, rather, you are working on a digital euro, maybe even CBDCs, so digital cash. In the US, this is now banned. So the government policy is to ban this and instead to work through stablecoins. So I was wondering what your vision would be to maintain some cooperation and some level of coordination with the US, what your view is on stablecoins. And I also noticed in your letter to the president that you don't rule out working with the private sector on this. You say the private sector should really be part of the mix. So I was wondering if you could give us a vision for maintaining at least some level of coordination across the Atlantic on digital currency.
To make a long story short, because I could be very long about currencies, I will not comment about the US policy and the latest one from January on.
You've already commented on so many other US policies, I thought.
Yes, but on this one, I can understand it's a priority and to private issuers of quote-unquote private currencies. Mm-hmm. and there are no spillovers for us, which is probably a difference with other issues I mentioned. On our side, if you look at currency for centuries, and here I could be very long, but it has always been a public-private partnership. If you look at currencies, I could come to the Middle Age or to the 19th century, you always had private currencies issued by banks and public currency, which is the monetary anchor of the system. It used to be gold and silver some centuries ago. It used to be paper banknotes when the Banque de France was created in 1800. And now we live in a digital world. So this is the evidence for central bank digital currency. If you need this monetary anchor, you must have a digital form of it. And especially for us Europeans, the idea that we would completely rely for digital currency on private issuers and non-European ones is still more obvious. But it will be a partnership with commercial banks. We don't intend to open customer accounts. We don't intend to give any specific advantage to the digital euro versus banks deposit. We offer a freedom of choice to each European citizens to have either the public currency, digital euro, or the private currency, as they have today between banknotes and the commercial money bank. But again, we live in a digital world, so I think it's the obvious.
Thank you. I was wondering if we have any questions in the room. Please do raise your hand. David?
Thank you. Yes, so my name is David Marsh. You were saying, Mr. Villeroy de Galhau, that there's a calculability about Europe, which is maybe in contrast to what's happening in the United States. But of course, there is a fairly fraught situation in both Germany and France at the moment. There seems to be like a 2-year gap where something has got to happen of importance to help whoever might be coming in after Mr. Macron. What advice would you give to Mr. Merz and Mr. Macron about how to make the euro maybe a more resilient international currency? It might mean the Germans have to do some things that are not really very favourable at the moment to the CDU, like issue some more European debt. So speaking from your point of view of independence, but somebody who knows the two countries pretty well, what's the agenda for a sort of joint Franco-German démarche?
If I may say it with a smile, my impression looking at Mr. Macron and Mr. Herr Merz is that they don't need my advice to get together. And look at what happened since February. It's quite impressive, this acceleration on the German side and in the French-German cooperation. So it's more visible on defense at present. But I see no reason why it wouldn't come now on the economic front, what I call the second leg. Obviously, the European Commission has a key role to play, and this is why I mentioned the competitiveness compass and the savings and investment union proposals. But now the next steps are to translate them in a legislative proposal which should be on the table in the next month, and to have a final calendar for implementation. It's not up to me to determine it, but this would be probably my suggestion to the political leaders in Paris, Berlin, also in Rome and elsewhere, but I insist on Brussels. I see no reason, when you look presently at political roadblocks, why it wouldn't succeed, because there is, and you are aware of that, David, there is a new political feeling in Europe.
Thank you. I'll take 2 questions. Please make them very short. Sir?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Fabrice Naudet-Langlois, a French reporter with the French newspaper Le Figaro. Governor, I don't know to what extent your very busy schedule let you get some information about Secretary Bessent's remarks this morning on the IMF and World Bank. Mr. Bessent said that he wants the US to take the leadership on both institutions, that they should come back to their core and historical missions, don't deal anymore with climate. Do you have any comment on this?
I I guess it's a bit too early to comment, and we will have several multilateral discussions, G7, G20, IMF meetings in the next 3 days to elaborate a bit more. But I think we need everybody around the table. And I mentioned some issues, what I call pragmatic multilateralism, where I don't see why we couldn't make real practical progress in the quarters and years to come. So we will see, but I strongly hope we can support together these institutions because we have these challenges in common. So
to unpick what you mean by pragmatic multilateralism, does this mean restricting our focus? And would that also apply to the two institutions that we're meeting to talk about?
No, about the World Bank, I will not comment because I'm not competent. About the IMF, I mentioned a list of possible issues which is not that restrictive. Let us suppose we come to an agreement on financial stability, cross-border payments, cyber, financial crime, etc.
That would already be quite a lot.
It wouldn't be too bad. And this adds, perhaps to add to my answer, this had to a core role of the IMF, which is to share economic analysis, the diagnosis, and perhaps the therapy. But we will first, in these 3 days, discuss about the IMF economic forecast. They're on the table. Do we agree on that? What kind of consequences are there? So I think if we didn't have the IMF, we would have to invent something else.
Would you put it in Washington, D.C.? Where would it be based?
No, again, as it's based in this country, let this country support and participate. This is my hope.
Thank you. The internet audience has been quite shy, unusually so. There is one question that's come in on immobilized Russian assets, a question that we cover quite a lot at the GeoEconomics Center. It's known that some are immobilized at the Banque de France, much less than in the Belgian-based clearinghouse, Euroclear. But I was wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit on the French perspective and your institution's perspective. It's known that Europe has a more conservative approach to these. Europe is contributing via interest income, but on seizure, very conservative.
This idea of European conservatism, can I really challenge it? First, we are the first contributor to Ukrainian aid, and still more today, as you know. Second, we used all these assets, and this was a very important G7 decision last year. On the Italian presidency, we used to have a special loan to Ukraine, whose interests are paid and guaranteed with this Russian assets. If one day a peace agreement comes, which we all hope, but we don't know, it could be a different question. But at present, these Russian assets are freezed and be used for Ukraine and this so-called ERA loan. And this was a decisive achievement.
Absolutely.
So they are not sleeping, so to say.
So the 50 billion loan for Ukraine is over half of Ukraine's annual budget, something that the GeoEconomics Center is proud to have supported. I think my use of the word conservatism was simply because that is sometimes used as a term in Washington, D.C. to characterize Europe's behavior. But I often say that if the shoe was on the other foot and the assets were stored in the US, maybe the US would be slightly more conservative on this issue too.
But as said, I disagree with this word, and if everybody in the G7 was, including this country, was as conservative as Ukraine as Europe is, it would help.
So, thank you very much, Mr. Governor. It's been a pleasure to have you at the Atlantic Council. Thank you to everyone who's been involved in this event. And we've mentioned a few sort of interesting topics during this conversation. The Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center covers all of them. So our central bank digital currency tracker, our trade tracker, all of these, or our trade tariff tracker, all of these things you can find on our website. So I encourage you to have a look. But thank you very much, Mr. Governor, for your time, and good luck this week. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.